The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Last week, the state legislature passed its earliest budget in decades, but tonight's guest voted a very loud no on a couple of crucial items. We'll find out why. We're also in the throes of a controversial redistricting that has left a number of districts crawling all over the Bronx map. Tonight's guest has been outspoken about that. He's also partnering on a bill about the health disparities issue that we did a show on last week. There's also a box full of Bronx politics to talk about with tonight's guests. And if you'd like to join in the dialogue about those things or anything else, then call in at 718-960-7241. You can also email questions or comments to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. Please join me in welcoming back to Bronx Talk the senator from the 33rd Senatorial District in the Bronx, Gustavo Rivera. Good evening, Senator. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. As always, it is a pleasure to be here.
So, at least on one level, on some levels, you must be happy about the fact that we have a budget, overall the nature of the budget, the first time in decades that it's happened on time and in a what seems to be a reasonable process. Before we get into some of your objections, why has this happened, and is that a correct assumption that you're kind of proud of the legislature and the governor for getting together and making it happen?
Well, I think that there might have been some missed opportunities, but we did get a budget done not only on time, but I'd like to point out the fact that it was done during the daytime. It did not get done in the middle of the night, unlike some other things that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. And I believe that there were a couple of good things in it. There was, for example, we managed to rescue something called the Neighborhood Preservation Program, as well as the Rural Preservation Program. Both of them were cut in the original version of the governor's budget. I was one of the folks that wrote letters to the governor asking for these programs to come back. They provide assistance to people that are trying to stay in their homes, and it's something that happens all across the state of New York, and we were able to keep that in there. So there were a few things that we were able to do in it that I think were good, but there were more than a few missed opportunities.
You're obviously not a 30-year veteran of the Senate, so you can't talk firsthand about things that have happened in the past or compare, this one versus, many, many years ago. But what's your sense about the nature of discourse? Give some of our viewers and your constituents an idea about the nature of discourse. Is it ugly? Is it, politically laden? Or are there reasonable discussions about issues of importance that I think people would be happy to know about, that actually the legislature is working as opposed to dysfunction?
It really depends what we're talking about. In the issues that we discussed on, first of all, the budget is divided into 11 different budget bills. So we don't take one vote, we take 11 different votes. Excuse me. And so the bills that we voted on for the budget were all voted in the middle of the day. We all had time to discuss them on the floor to really get into the meat, the bones and the meat of everything that happened in those bills. And so in a lot of those, there were definitely some conversations that were reasonable. And again, I think that there were some missed opportunities, but overall it was positive. But unfortunately, there's some instances in which those type of conversations did not happen. I would point to something that happened the week before we passed the budget, which was the midnight session in which, among many other things, an unfair and bad plan for redistricting was passed. There was a vote on Tier 6 that also was passed, which I think was a bad vote and is bad policy. And all of those things were done in the middle of the night. They were shoved down the throats of legislators and the state of New York, and I don't think that There were no good conversations about that. There were no reasonable discussions about what those policies were. Those were just done. Thankfully, the budget was a much friendlier process and certainly more reasonable, but there's still some areas in which we need to do better.
We'll talk about redistricting in a moment. It's certainly one of the things on our list, and I know on the minds of many of our viewers. Let's talk about this capital funds. It's S.6254D. You spoke, I thought, rather eloquently on the floor about it. You seem pretty strong about it. Rather than me, kind of lay the groundwork, why don't you explain what you didn't like about the capital funds bill?
Well, this is one of 3 bills that I voted against. In the case of the capital projects bill, for your viewers, capital projects, this capital budget bill basically takes state money to make sure that it goes to construction projects all across the state. I voted no against it because I do not believe that enough money was given to the MTA, particularly as it refers to transit. You have to consider that a quarter of the population of the state uses mass transit. Certainly, almost 90% of the people that live in the district that I represent use bus and train to get to work and from work every single day. I use the bus and the trains on a pretty regular basis myself. This is something that is incredibly important to my district and to the city of New York. Not enough funding was allocated in this particular budget, so I voted against that bill.
I think constituents would hear that and say, well, that's good. I mean, obviously mass transit and keeping the fares down is something that they would like to know that their legislator is fighting for. On the other hand, a lot of no votes, a lot of your colleagues who agreed with you, all of a sudden we could be back into a situation like we have been in the past for all these dozens of years where we don't have a budget. So isn't there kind of a benefit to the fact, well, maybe this one didn't work out, but we let that one go and in the name of getting a budget passed and kind of a functionality for the state of New York?
Well, I believe it is my responsibility ultimately to represent the people here in the Bronx, in the 33rd District. And when I look at the interests of those folks and when I look at how these votes are going to impact them, I have to consider ultimately what is going to happen to them. And as it refers to this particular budget bill, we're talking about transit money that would go to make sure that we don't lose bus routes, that we don't lose bus stops, that we get more service or more regular service on the trains, that we don't have more rise in the price of a train ride. All of these things I have to consider when I'm looking at these bills. And in this case in particular, I thought that ultimately it was not a good bill for the 33rd District or the people that I represent, and so I voted against it.
Were you a lone wolf in this, or did you have many colleagues, and I guess we'd like to know in the Bronx, who said, you know what, he's right here? Or did others just say, no, let's go the other way?
I don't know how many folks voted against this piece of legislation. I know that maybe there were 5 or 6 of my Democratic colleagues that did, but I don't recall exactly who they were.
Do you think that as a result of this, we are going to get a fare hike, or at minimum we're going to get the MTA to say, well, you know what, they didn't fund our coffers, and so what else are we supposed to do? I mean, do you think that that's inevitable, or there's still a way out of that potential eventuality?
Well, I think that one of the basic conversations that we need to have at the state level is the fact that we have not made the commitment as a state to transit that we need to make. The problem is that there's been so many times in the last couple of years where the state, either the legislature or certainly the governor, does this little thing called a sweep. They take funds that are supposed to be dedicated taxes, so these are taxes from the people of the state of New York and all sorts of different places, that are supposed to be dedicated to transit funding. And yet, the funds sit there, and then they're swept so that they can do something else with them. And then that is the reason why most of us have the fares that are rising, because the MTA then needs to go into debt to be able to pay for what they need to do on a daily basis for operational costs or capital costs. Ultimately, we need to have a conversation at the state level of recommitting ourselves to public transit.
It's obviously a pie. It's not a matter of you saying, well, let's get more money. Where would you have taken money from to pay for the potential expenditures for MTA, for example?
Well, I think that the first thing is to consider what has happened in years past and the fact that dedicated transit funding doesn't exist in what's known as a lockbox. What happens is that you have taxes which are supposed to be dedicated to transit, but they don't go into a dedicated transit fund that is locked so that you can't get access to it. It goes into the general fund. And so that's where billions of dollars sit, and they move from one place to another. Mostly what I thought was that, and on this particular issue, I think that we need to have people like myself who represent so many transit riders, we need to continue to make the case not only on the floor but to our colleagues and to the governor that we need to recommit ourselves to public transit and that we're not doing a good job right now of making sure that the MTA is adequately funded.
Bill 6250D for state operations. I'll lay it out there. That was another no vote from you. Why?
Well, state operations, what that bill does is that you get the budget for the different state agencies. And in particular, what I was particularly concerned about was the fact that the governor touted the creation of the TPU, or Tenant Protection Unit, within the housing agency at the state level. And unfortunately, ultimately, the budget did not include funding for the Tenant Protection Unit. I believe that is a big problem because even though there have been some comments from the governor and from the second floor that they're going to fund it, I wanted to see it in the budget because I believe when you look at the district that I represent, 72,000 units of rent-stabilized apartments, hundreds of other thousands of people that live in some sort of rental situation and are tenants themselves, and then you have a creation, which I believe is a good thing, of a unit within the housing department which would serve to make sure that their rights are observed and are protected, and we didn't fund it. So I had a problem with it not being funded, so I voted against that piece of legislation.
The other one that you voted no on was 6256, the health and mental hygiene. I have a number of questions about that. Why don't you explain it and then we'll follow up.
The main problem that I had with it is that, well, last year when the president passed the Affordable Care Act at the national level, there is something that needs to be done at the state level in each state so that by 2014 the Affordable Care Act would come into effect. And to do that, part of what this state has to do, and every other state as well, is create what is known as a healthcare exchange. So the federal government is giving money to states so that they can establish a healthcare exchange so that then when 2014 comes around, you will have, in the case of New York, you would have 1 million more New Yorkers that would have access to health care. So this is something that we should have created last year. We would have gotten federal funding for it then. It is something that we should have done this year. We didn't get it this year, and because it was not in the budget, I voted against it.
So let's just, I realize that there's a dialogue going on that neither of us can control, and that's going on in the Supreme Court right now. But let's say that the Health Care Reform Act continues along.
Yes.
How will New York State handle its aspect of the health insurance exchange and establishing the health insurance exchange if, as you say, the funding is not there to fund it? Seems to me New Yorkers would be behind the eight ball from taking advantage of the benefits of that legislation.
Well, what happened here is that the governor stated that we create the healthcare exchanges through an executive order. But I believe that the Republicans in the Senate, in particular my colleagues there, should be ashamed of the fact that we did not do it in the legislative session, that we didn't do it in the budget as we should have done.
That it will require a governor's executive
Correct.
order to make that happen.
Correct. So the governor said he understands that we need to create this at the state level, so he is going to do it through an executive order. He stated so last week, and we hope that we will do it in the next couple of months.
So that's the same monies. You're saying this was procedurally not the way to do it, that the state should have endorsed the fact that it potentially is coming from the federal government. Maybe some of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle are hedging a bet that the act will be struck down in some form and they won't have to go that route. Who knows?
Likely, but I think that what we have to focus on is that this is current federal law, and again, current federal law that would allow 1 million more New Yorkers to have access to health care by 2014. That is what we should be focusing on. The Republicans were not, so they played politics. You think that the Tea Party politics just exists somewhere down south. Unfortunately, on this case, it exists in New York as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about health care. Whether you saw it or not, a couple of weeks ago we did a show here on BronxTalk about health disparities and the fact that many New Yorkers, many Bronxites in particular, get less health care, get less quality health care because of the type of insurance or lack of insurance that they have. The two guests that we have were very complimentary to you because of your support for the health disparities bill. In this climate right now, does this have a chance of moving forward, and are you optimistic about it, or is this one you're going to have to strap yourself in and try and gain more support, especially on the other side of the aisle, to make it happen?
I always believe that you should strap yourself in and prepare yourself for a hard
You may as
battle.
well, yeah.
Yes. It is never, the good things are never easy. And in this case, what we're talking about is something very basic. I believe, and certainly the advocates that you had on here a couple of weeks ago, believe that regardless of where the payment for your health care ultimately comes from, you should be treated the same. And the problem with this is that there is so much evidence that demonstrates that there's many medical institutions that do not do this. They actually separate people out, they treat them differently, and what this leads to ultimately is not only lower quality health care and negative health impacts on majority of people of color. These are the people that are impacted, poor folks and people of color. These are the folks that are impacted by this distinction in service. But also there's some cost issues as well. There's a lot of demonstrated evidence that shows that if you treated people in the same environment with the same level of care, you would be able to save money. Ultimately, you wouldn't have some people that, because they're not treated continuously by the same doctors, they're treated by somebody else every time they go to the clinic. They would have all sorts of costs that are associated.
So they're sicker. They have to go to the emergency room. They
Correct.
don't have their normal care by their regular physician. And frankly, I'll just jump in. It costs us all a lot more money.
Correct.
And so this bill would require similar care for whomever walks into a hospital or any health delivery facility.
It would mean that when an individual walks into a healthcare facility, he or she would not be separated out depending on what their ultimate payment of their healthcare comes from. So they wouldn't be told. There's actually institutions in New York City where there are brand new, state-of-the-art, beautifully designed facilities for individuals that are privately insured, while clinics are a couple of blocks away in older buildings that are remodeled to make sure that they can stay over there. There is a lot of evidence that this exists. It creates different levels of care. It costs us more money. This is not going to be an easy fight. It is not going to be an easy fight, but I believe it is worth fighting. And I'm very optimistic that in the long term we'll be able to pass this bill.
Before we talk about redistricting, let's go to the telephone. I think it was Lillian from the North Bronx. Is that who we had? Hi, Lillian. How are you?
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
I wanted to mention we're from Bronx North Council of Presidents,
Okay.
and the senator had an opportunity to meet with our delegation. And we have reached out to the city council members in regards to capital funding for the New York City Housing Authority for our residents. A lot of us are suffering because the infrastructure is beyond repair. We're getting told that there's no funding, that it's the city, it's the state. I would like to know, and I'm interested because I know Ruth Hassel-Thompson, a colleague, of course, of the senator, has a very good position when it comes to the Housing Authority and providing funding and maintaining funding and support in spite of our budget constraints.
Right.
So I'm interested to know, is he on board with Senator Ruth Hassel-Thompson regarding and letting the other colleagues know that we do know that there's disparities in medical, and we know that there's a lot of other things going on. But housing is a very big issue.
Okay.
I'm sure he's faced with that on a day-to-day basis in his office as well.
Couldn't have a better question. Very important. Lily, thank you.
Yeah, Lillian, thank you for the question, Lillian. I agree wholeheartedly with both Lillian and my colleague Ruth Hassel-Thompson when it comes to housing. I don't have as many NYCHA developments in my district as Ruth does. She has most of the housing developments in the Bronx are in Ruth's district. But I agree with her wholeheartedly that we have to make sure that funding for NYCHA stays strong, and that there's a lot of things that we have to do with that authority to make sure that it serves the people of the city in the best way possible. It is a city authority, So I am a state representative, and I can certainly push to make sure that there's changes that happen there, but it is a city authority.
This was not part of your state budget vote,
Correct.
obviously. So I guess the best you can do is continue to lobby, work with your colleague to lobby your colleagues in the city council to keep that funding strong and to help Lily and her neighbors out who are fighting for this.
I will certainly continue to do that, yes.
Okay, so you have his support, Lily. You were not happy with the governor's compromise on redistricting, which allowed him, in many ways, to get that budget passed. It was kind of part of the dialogue there. You have been very outspoken about independent redistricting. Is this possible in this day and age? It seems to me redistricting is viewed, and you talked about it at the outset of the show, as, you know what, this is something that we still want to control. And I say we, I'm talking about legislators. Do you think it's ever going to be possible to get independent redistricting, or this is just something that's going to ultimately stay controlled by individuals or parties in the houses of the legislature?
The first thing I'll say to you, Gary, is that I am deeply, deeply disappointed in the governor, because he gave us his word that he would veto any lines that were drawn by a political process. The ultimate plan that was passed a couple of weeks ago was hyper-political. It was 98% the same as the original plan that the governor called hyper-political. It is a plan that disenfranchises minority communities across the state of New York, splits up communities. Just to give you an example, right here, where we are sitting right now, to our east, there is a community of Norwood and Bedford Park that, in this plan, was split up between 3 different senators. And just today...
Not even 2, 3 different senators.
3 different senators. And I just had a meeting today in which some constituents were telling me that they were concerned because they had seen in the past that when they're represented not by one person but by a couple of different people, they feel that they're not represented well.
So just to illustrate for our viewers and for Bronxites how this could play, so you could live in an apartment building in the Bronx, and across your street they're represented by somebody else. So even though you share common issues, it becomes very difficult, or more difficult anyway, to get unanimity over the issues, so you can have somebody fighting for that issue in the state legislature. Right? That's how it plays.
Correct. In redistricting jurisprudence, they're called communities of interest. And a community of interest is either a neighborhood, it is an ethnic group that is settled in a particular part of a city or of the state. And the idea is that these communities of interest should have the ability to get their interests represented well.
How do you wrest control away from the powers that be right now who are handling this? I mean, this seems to me this might have to be a court-ordered issue, because you're not going to get so many of your colleagues to vote and say, okay, I'd like to give up the authority on these things.
Where we are right now, Gary, is that the lines that were drawn and were passed by the governor, signed by him, again, deeply disappointed that he did this. We are challenging them in 2 places. We're challenging them in the Department of Justice. I believe that they can and should get involved, because this is a plan that violates the Voting Rights Act. I believe that strongly, and that disenfranchises minority communities all across the state by minimizing their political power. But we're also challenging it at the state level, where we're challenging the constitutionality of the creation of a 63rd district that the Republicans created in a part of the state that has lost population in the last 10 years and is overwhelmingly white, to make sure that they keep their artificial majority.
I pulled a picture out. Jane, if we could put this picture up there that I wanted to show, the senator probably is going to be familiar with it right away. Do people know exactly? This is what I pulled out of the newspaper the other day. Do people know what that is? I mean, you could say what it is.
Could you leave it up on the screen for a second? I'd want your viewers to focus on the district that is on the bottom right-hand corner. The bottom right-hand corner, you might not be able to tell that much, but that is the 28th senatorial district represented by Senator Serrano. It is a district that has for many, many years been in East Harlem and the Bronx, and all of a sudden, this district goes all the way to West 72nd Street.
Yeah, and you could see all the little pieces that are crafted in there. We could spend a lot of time on it. We could look at each one. By the way, the one full Bronx district was in the second from the right. That was I guess you would recognize that lobster was the 34th senatorial district. Bob from Riverdale is calling us, and I want to make sure to get him in. He always likes talking politics. Hi, Bob. How are you? Do we have Bob?
On
there we go.
Senate.
Hi.
and you've been involved in past elections. How do you see the state Senate after the November election? Who will control it? By how much? What seats will change? And what role will Governor Cuomo play or not play in the election?
Well, this is definitely don't have enough time for all of that.
Bob obviously writes down multi-part questions, and
but it's a good one.
It's a good one, and we can have a whole show about it. I will tell you the following: the plan that we currently have, as I was saying, we believe strongly that we can defeat it either at the Department of Justice level or here by challenging the constitutionality of the 63rd District. If either of those challenges are won, then the entire process is scrapped. So I still believe strongly that we will have an opportunity to be the majority in the state Senate come November.
What do you think about the independent party founded by your colleague, Senator Jeff Kline, which kind of take some of the balance of power, or at least the chance to have the balance of power, away from Democrats?
Well, as I've stated many times before, I am disappointed in the actions of Senator Kline. I do not believe that they make us stronger as Democrats. I believe that we need to deal with our issues inside the family, and that if that's the best way to deal with them, as opposed to going off and doing something separate. Disappointed in his actions, and I obviously think that we need to be stronger as Democrats, and we should do that together.
Almost out of time, but everybody's going to be talking about it over the next couple of weeks and months. If, in fact, Adrian Espaillat runs against Charlie Rangel, do you know who you would support in that circumstance?
Well, I haven't made an endorsement in that race yet.
It's not even a race yet. It's all just us pundits talking.
Well, actually, he announced yesterday.
He did? I didn't see
Adriano
that.
Espaillat announced yesterday. I haven't made an endorsement in this race. I believe he's going to be a formidable challenger to Congressman Rangel. I have a lot of respect for Congressman Rangel, and I have a lot of respect for Adriano. He's been a colleague, an ally, and a friend, and he's been a leader in housing issues. We were able to both pass a stronger rent regulation bill last.
Before we run out of time,
Yes.
no answer on that one yet.
I haven't made an endorsement.
The race apparently to succeed Assemblyman Peter Rivera, would you support his Chief of Staff Danny Figueroa or Louis Sepulveda, who has been an assistant for one of your colleagues, Senator Diaz?
I have not made an endorsement in that race either.
I'm striking out here. Anyway, but we hit a home run with having you here tonight, Senator Gustavo Rivera. We hope you'll come back and maybe answer some of those questions at some point.
Anytime, Gary.
It's great to have you. And folks, if you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Archives of Bronx Talk available at bronxnet.org. You click Bronx Talk on the right-hand navigation bar. Also, please make sure that you become a fan of Bronx Talk on Facebook. I'm going to make the Senator do that, too. Next week, we'll visit the other New York State legislative body. On April 9th, Assemblyman Jeffrey Dinowitz will be with us to talk about the other house. On April 16th, a very important issue, we'll get into the Trayvon Martin case, as well as the recent police shooting of a Bronx teen in Williamsbridge. So Bronx Talk Monday nights at 9 here on BronxNet 67, Verizon Fios 33. Special thanks, of course, to our great producer, Jane Folloro, director Michael Arias, to Dina, the cast of thousands who are around us, and to you, good night.
I remember how much you said you liked